Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast. I'm Maggie, and I will be your host today, and I'm just so glad to have you here. Whether this is your first time listening or you've been with us for years, we would love for you to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And just as a reminder, you can find today's show notes with all the relevant links at globalmissionstoolbox.com/podcast. Today, we're talking about a model of ministry that's gaining momentum, not only in North America, but around the world, co-vocational ministry. Many of us are familiar with bi-vocational pastors or missionaries, but co-vocational ministry offers a fresh and intentional approach to integrating faith, work, and mission. Our guest today is Dr. Brad Brisco, the Director of Multiplication Strategies for the SEND Network at the North American Mission Board. Brad's research has focused on helping existing congregations move in a more missional direction. He's also an author, and we will be discussing the ideas he presents in his book, Co-vocational Church Planting. We've titled today's episode, The Case for Co-vocational Ministry. Brad, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation, Maggie.
Well, we are super excited to dive into co-vocational ministry with you, and we so appreciate all the effort you've made to create resources that are going to support churches and church planters. Could you maybe just give us a quick sketch of the SEND network for us, just in case our listeners aren't familiar with y'all?
Yeah, of course. So the SEND network is a church planting arm of a larger organization called the North American Mission Board. I've actually worked for that group now for over 25 years. And our primary focus is to help recruit, train, and coach church planters. We partner with existing churches to do that. And since 2010, I think we've seen over 10,000 church plants that we've participated in. Just in this last year, we've planted just over 900 churches, and that's in the United States and Canada both. So yeah, we're all about church planting.
Man, that's such an encouragement. 900 churches. That's wonderful.
Just this year. Yep.
Wow. So before we get into all the nuances of co-vocational ministry, I'm wondering if you could begin by helping us recapture a theology of work, just as a starting place or a foundation for this conversation.
Yeah. So first, I would say, unfortunately, I don't think the church has done a great job helping people think really well about their work. So I often say, just the phrase you just used, that we need to recapture what I would call a robust theology of work. And that involves lots of different things. But for me, it involves at least 5 kind of key points. So let me just list them here real quick. I would say, first off, that work is a part of God's design. And what I mean by that is God's given us the task of cultivating and caring for creation. So I think that's a good place to start. Is we need to see that our work in the marketplace is a part of God's original design. Secondly, I would say work has dignity, and what I mean by that is that all work matters. And kind of a nuance or piece of that is I think we need to blow up or at least diminish what I would call the sacred secular divide, where we think some callings or vocations are sacred and other vocations or callings are secular. I don't think that's helpful, and I don't think it's biblical. So we part of recapturing a robust theology of work is recognizing all work matters or all work has dignity. Third, I would say work is a means of service. And what I mean by that is we need to recognize how our work in the marketplace brings blessing or common good to those environments or our communities. Fourth, I would say work is actually an act of worship. So most of us are familiar with the Colossians 3:23, work as for the Lord. So we need to see work really as an act of worship. And then lastly, I would say we need to help try to see and understand how our work contributes to and participates in God's redemptive mission. So I would say some work, it's more difficult to kind of make that connection. But if we work at it, I think we can identify, regardless of what God's called you to do in the marketplace, we can identify how that work actually contributes to God's mission. So all of that are just kind of like different components of what I would call a robust theology of work.
I think that's crucial. And I know that a lot of our listeners are actually listening to this podcast on their way to their traditional 9-to-5. Most of them are super passionate about global missions, but they aren't in a full-time ministry position. So I really, really liked what you said there about the dignity of work. And I'm wondering if I could just ask for a quick plug for them. Do you have any encouragement for them as they head into their workday?
That's great. And that's interesting to think about. Yeah, listening to this while they're heading into work. So, well, I would repeat what I said just a minute ago, that all work matters. But I guess if I had the opportunity to speak to someone specifically, I would say your work matters. And then there would be some things I would just encourage them to ask, some questions to ask. I mean, I would say, ask yourself, how does my work fit into God's redemptive mission? Ask yourself, what common good am I bringing into the lives of others? But also look for ways you can connect with people in your work. Like, ask, where is God at work in my workplace? And, a lot of times when we talk about mission, we talk about our neighborhoods and we talk about how can I be a good neighbor? I actually think that's a good question to ask in our workplace, is ask yourself, how can I be a good neighbor in my workplace? Like, where and how can I be a blessing to my coworkers, maybe my customers or clients? Ask, how can I show the love and compassion of Jesus to others, like in my work and through my work? So yeah, just go back and try to ask and try to recognize where does my work contribute to and participate in God's mission, and then how can I be a good neighbor in the workplace where God has sent me.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah. I had the privilege of working as a barista after I graduated from college. And I often say that that's the best season of ministry I've ever had. Because I just was constantly in a place where people were hungry for truth. So I hope that that's an encouragement to you, to our listeners. And Brad, just to sort of jump back into this conversation as it's intended, could you give us a working definition of bi-vocational and co-vocational ministry to help us understand the definitions and the differences between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. So I might back up just a little bit. Sometimes whenever I talk about kind of definitions and the nuances between bivo and covo, I'll typically start by talking about, kind of an aspect that's problematic, I think, around the language of bivocational. And what I mean by that is I think too often the word bivocational actually gets in the way of what we want to see accomplished. And the way I usually describe that is I'll say, if you've ever heard the word bifurcate, to bifurcate means to take one thing and divide it into two parts. Well, unfortunately, I think we do that too often with around the language or the understanding of bivocationalism. So we have too many bivocational leaders that think something like this. They say, I do my work over here, so I can do mission and ministry over here. So that's bifurcating or compartmentalizing work and mission. Well, we started probably about a decade ago. We felt like we needed to expand that language. We not change the language, but we needed to expand it. So we started playing around with different words, and we landed on the word co-vocational. And think about that word as opposed to bivocational. So co-vocational, C-O, comes from the Latin prefix com, C-O-M, which means to have in common, or it's about equality or bringing things together. So I like to say, think of words like co-pilot, co-author, co-laborer, co-panion. It's all about aligning those two things rather than compartmentalizing. So I just think it's helpful language that I hope calls people out of the pews that have full-time callings in the marketplace. But here's a little nuance for me, a little kind of definition between the two. So you'll notice I still use the language of bivo and covo, but here's the difference for me. A bivocational church planter is someone that has a part-time job in the marketplace that they see as temporary. So in other words, their hope or dream or aspiration is that the church plant would grow large enough that they could leave their part-time job and focus full-time on the church. So I always say, 2 thumbs up. Nothing wrong with that. A lot of times we'll reference the Apostle Paul in Acts 18 as a tent maker, that's all good. But a co-vocational church planter is someone that has a primary calling in the marketplace that they never intend to leave. In other words, they know God's called and wired them to be a barista or an architect or an engineer or a school teacher or a doctor or a mechanic, whatever it is. They know God's called me to do this, but at the same time, they feel like God's called them to start something. So I want them to understand they don't have to choose. You don't have to choose between a calling in the marketplace and mission and ministry. Now, we have to think differently about those things. But I want to encourage people to say, no, you can stay, live into the calling that God's wired you to do in the marketplace, and then let's start something at the same time. So for me, that's kind of my working definition of covo and kind of the slight nuance between covo and bivo.
I really like the distinction there. And I really like that there isn't one that's necessarily better than the other. They're both valuable models for ministry. I am wondering, because it's such a close title and there's such a delicate, shall we say, nuance between the two, how do you find people's attitudes or assumptions are towards co-vocational ministry? I would assume that that's not maybe a word that people are as familiar with. I think a lot of people have heard of bi-vocational, pastors, etc. So I'm just curious what kind of impression people usually come to you with when it happens to do with co-vocational ministry.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first off, I think if someone's hasn't really been introduced to or struggled with the benefits of being co-vocational, they just see the challenges. And a lot of times when we think of kind of like the prevailing model of church, especially in a North American context, we think it's not possible because you can't work 40 or 50 or 60 hours a week in the marketplace and plant a church the way we've historically planted churches. And I would agree with that. I would say if you are co-vocational, we have to completely rethink church and church planting. What I mean by the benefits is I'm convinced there are enormous missiological and financial benefits of being co-vocational. And what I recognize is if I have time to like unpack those missiological and financial benefits, most people recognize, oh, okay, no, now I get it. But without really understanding those benefits, yeah, it just sounds like one enormous challenge, to live in both of those worlds. But I would also say those church planters that I know of that are co-vocational, they love it because they're experiencing both those missiological and financial benefits. So I understand people like just seeing the challenge of it, but I'd love to create space to talk about the benefits, because once we really have the opportunity to talk about it, they see that, okay, no, I see why this is a way, not just of the future, but it's actually a way of the present to really be in the marketplace at the same time we're engaged in mission.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go there. Could you paint a picture for us of what you wish people would imagine when they're thinking of co-vocational ministry?
Yeah. So there's a lot here. Let me just try to make it as concise as possible. So there's a couple of different things. First off, I would say, let me just hit on a couple of the key missiological and financial benefits. Because again, I just think if you're in the marketplace, you just need to hear these things, I hope, as a word of encouragement. So when I talk about missiological benefits, there's just a couple of things there I want to highlight. First off, I would say you have access to a mission field you would never have otherwise. And Maggie, you already alluded to this, talking about when you were a barista. You had relational opportunities that you would never have if you would have been a fully funded leader inside the walls of the church. Because the reality is most fully funded leaders, they spend all their time with church people. But when you're in the marketplace, you just have access to a mission field you wouldn't have otherwise. But another piece of that I think is really important for us to talk about is I think it gives you enormous street cred or respectability, both inside the church and outside the church. So what I mean by inside the church is I think, people in the congregation or in that church plant, they appreciate the fact that you can understand, at least on some level, what they're experiencing Monday through Friday in the marketplace. Like you understand what it means to have a boss that maybe is a struggle sometimes, or you understand what it means to have coworkers and to be on a schedule. And so I think there's some respectability there with the congregation. But maybe even more important than that, I think there's great street cred or respectability with people outside the walls of the church. So we all know that, when you meet somebody new, it's not very long before someone asks you what you do. And if you have to lead with, well, I'm a pastor or I'm a church planter, there's a lot of context around the world where that just sounds weird, right? Like church planter, what does that even mean? But if you can lead with your marketplace calling, it just creates a much longer runway relationally, because we know a lot of times you say, well, I'm a pastor, it could end that conversation right then, depending on the views that people have about church and religion. So that's what I mean by the missiological benefits. Really quickly, the financial benefits, I usually frame them around three little phrases. I'll say, first off, there's enormous financial benefits for the church planter. So what I mean by that is that I've just recognized over the years that when the primary support's coming from the marketplace for the church planter, especially if that marketplace calling provides benefits, like insurance or vacation or a retirement, there's just less financial strain on the church planter and the church planter's family, because the church planter doesn't have to have multiple side hustles to try to make ends meet. So there's greater financial stability for the church planter. Secondly, I would say there's greater financial stability for the church plant. So this is kind of a no-brainer, but when the primary support for the planter is coming from the marketplace, there's just more resources available for mission and ministry, because you don't, that new small little church plant doesn't have to come up with a salary to pay the church planter. And then lastly is what I call the church planting entity. So this could be a denomination or a church planting network. The reality is we don't have enough money to plant all the churches that we need to plant with fully funded planters. So the only way we're going to see a real church planting movement is by engaging with bivocational and co-vocational planters. And then Maggie, the very last thing I would say, just kind of in addition to those benefits, is I know this sounds a little idealistic, but when I think about the perfect case scenario of what this looks like in the future, I think it involves 2 or 3 co-vocational couples and 2 or 3 co-vocational singles that all agree to go together to plant a church. And while none of them are full-time, each of them can commit to giving 4 hours or 6 hours or 8 hours a week to the church plant. So can you imagine if you had 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 people that were all co-vocational in the marketplace? Think about the missiological and the relational connections they would have with all of them in the marketplace. And then also consider the incredible financial stability that that group would have when they all have callings in the marketplace and none of them have to be fully funded or supported by the church plant. So that's kind of the way I envision co-vocational church planting in the future, is we actually have co-vocational teams that go together to plant a church.
Yeah, I think teams are so crucial, so crucial to get anything off the ground. Man, that's amazing. I'm wondering, I don't want to throw you off too much here. So if you can't think of something, that's okay. But I'm just wondering if you have like a story from a church where you've seen this work really well, that you could help us connect to a little bit personally, because just towards the end there where you were describing a team, I was like, oh, I'm starting to see it. Everything you listed is so positive and there's so much potential for it. But just could you help us connect it personally a little bit with a story, do you think?
Yeah, sure. Jokingly, sometimes I'll tell people, you name any calling in the marketplace, and I can tell you a church planter that is planting a church while doing that. And I mean it. I mean, from an anesthesiologist to a bus driver to a fireman, police officer, real estate. I mean, it just runs the gamut. So there's a lots of beautiful stories. And before we're finished, I'll share with you a website that you can go to where we've tried to include a bunch of those stories kind of down at the bottom of the website in written form. But I'll just give you an example. One of my favorite stories is a friend of mine that's in California. He's a fireman, and he planted a church as a fireman, and he loves being a fireman. I joke all the time that if you would hear him talk about being a fireman, it would make you want to be a fireman. He planted a church and as a fireman, and it's interesting, when the church grew large enough that the church was like pressuring him, because they could replace his fireman's salary at some point. They were pressuring him to quit being a fireman and come full-time to the church. And he said, no. He said, God's called me to be a fireman. So instead of leaving his co-vocational job in the marketplace to go to the church, they added additional staff, and all the staff are either bivocational or co-vocational. So that's another thing I say all the time, is that, my hope is that we'll actually have bivocational leaders that become co-vocational leaders. So in other words, when the church grows large enough that they could leave their job and focus on the church, they decide to stay. And they stay because they've experienced and understand the missiological and financial benefits of being in the marketplace. So instead of going full-time at the church, they just hire additional co-vocational staff people. So yeah, there are lots and lots, beautiful, beautiful stories all across the United States and Canada that I'm aware of. And, the reality is too, Maggie, is that this is the way of church planting globally. It's kind of interesting. It's primarily in the United States that we have to recapture co-vocational ministry, where this is really the way we plant churches globally and historically forever. So it's primarily an American context, not always, but primarily is where, we have to encourage people to stay in the marketplace.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. We're going to talk about some of those global implications when we come back. We'll pick up with Brad just in a moment here, but first we want to share a resource with you that we hope will encourage you and your church as you strive to serve the Lord. This is kind of a funny ad today because, broadly speaking, we always want to be encouraging you to visit the toolbox and access the resources that we've collected and created for you there. Our blog, the podcast, the GoJournal, and dozens of others of downloads and guides available to you. So absolutely keep visiting globalmissionstoolbox.com. We hope and pray that it will be encouraging and useful for you. And also, at the same time, we wanted to let you know that we've begun working on an entirely new initiative behind the scenes that we are super excited about. And we recognize that it may interrupt some of the user experience on the Toolbox's website. Just as we are constructing behind the scenes, we hope that you will have some patience with us. If anything is disrupted, please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know that you're having trouble accessing something. You can always reach us at info@globalmissionstoolbox.com, and we want to hear from you. We want to make sure that you have access to everything you need to continue serving and supporting missions from right where you are. So we are super excited to be working on this in the background, and we can't wait to bless you with it next year. Thanks as always for listening today, and we'll get back to our conversation with Brad now. So we're jumping back in with Brad Brisco, the Director of Multiplication Strategy with the Send Network. Brad, when you and I were talking initially in our pre-interview, you mentioned something that I think is critical for us as we consider co-vocational ministry, translating to the mission field. And that was the typical understanding of what makes a church, quote unquote, stable. Could you talk about that a little bit and why that could be especially limiting for the global church?
Yeah, that's a great question. So stable or sustainability, I think we have to completely rethink or redefine sustainability, because historically in the church planting world, we've defined sustainability as like the lead church planter receiving a full salary. And it just doesn't make sense. It certainly doesn't make sense for the global church, but I actually don't think it makes sense in any context. And part of the reason is that, there's a couple of things here. One is I think we have cities all around the world that are far too expensive to send a fully funded church planter into, downtown New York City or downtown Hong Kong or downtown Vancouver. It's just too expensive. But on the flip side, I think we have lots of different people groups where, if we define sustainability as the church planter eventually receiving a full salary, the math just doesn't add up. Just last week, I was talking to a Co-vo church planter that said that the average giving of his church plant congregation was $10 a week. Well, if that's never in a million years is that church planter going to have a full-time salary. So again, as we said earlier, the only way we're going to see a church planting movement is by engaging with bi-vocational and co-vocational church planters. So I think we have to redefine sustainability, and we can't define it by the church planter or the pastor receiving a full-time salary.
Totally. Well, I live in Canada, and I would say that the state and the size of our church in Canada is such that this is already a very practical consideration for a lot of church families here. And I think we will soon see a trend towards this in the missionaries that we send as well. So I'm wondering if you could just help us imagine what it would look like to send co-vocational missionaries.
Yeah, to be like team members on a church plant. It kind of goes back to what we said a minute ago. There's just enormous missiological benefits. They have access to a mission field they wouldn't have otherwise, or kind of a creative access point into that context in the workplace. And I would want to encourage them again to see their work, whatever it is, if it's a nurse or a construction worker or whatever, that they see the value of their work first place, but then also to make relational connections that maybe there are people then that they can bring in and connect to the church plant. So there's just, again, I've already said it, but there's just such enormous benefits thinking like a missionary in those contexts when you can make connections with people in the marketplace. I say all the time, more and more people are less and less interested in the programs and activities of the church. So we have to go where people are. And I think one of the best places to go is indeed the marketplace.
Well, I think you're starting to touch on something organically that even was coming up a little bit in the first part of our conversations. And I just want to play around with this idea of the longevity and the sustainability of missions, just the potential of that with co-vocational ministry, rather than maybe the traditional fully funded model. I think there's a lot of ways that this would start to create longevity on the field or even access. When I think of like creative access countries that are resistant to offering religious visas or giving any kind of sustainable visa to a missionary, I have a lot of friends that have to renew their visa every single year. And if they're already in the workplace, could that maybe just extend that visa a little bit? I don't know. I just think there's a lot to play around with there. But I did want to ask if you see, do missionaries who go with dual income, partially supported and also partially from the workforce, is that a benefit to them? I am hesitant to use this word, but the thing I'm thinking of is that potentially it would make them a little bit less vulnerable. But I'm hesitant to use the word vulnerable because I think that there are some really negative implications with it.
Right. Well, no, I don't think that's true. This is that question, the way you're just framing that question, Maggie, it reminds me, and this is primarily in United States and Canada that I've seen this. But so often church planters, they'll raise a bunch of money up front, or they'll have partnering churches to where they're like set up for the next 2 or 3 years. And what they're thinking is, hey, we're going to plant this church, and in 2 or 3 years, we're going to replace all the fundraising or the partnering relationships, and it doesn't happen. So they start by being fully funded because of all the partnerships that they've created. But a year in or 18 months in, they start recognizing the church isn't growing like they thought it would. And then they actually have to become bi-vocational or co-vocational. And unfortunately, too often they feel like failures because they started with the full support, and then 2 years later, they have to go get a part-time job in the marketplace. Where I want to say to them on the front end, get a part-time job. Even if you're not full-time in the marketplace, go work 1 day a week or 2 days a week somewhere. So all of that to say, I think what it does is it gives you a much longer runway without the financial pressures of knowing that 2 years, 3 years, 4 years from now, that funding is going to start to dry up. And I see this happen all the time where church planters, they have really beautiful, wonderful, important motives to start with by really reaching into the brokenness of their city. But then a year or two in, when they see some of the funding is going to start to dry up, they actually start reaching out to more and more Christians to try to have, kind of some tithing income coming into the church to replace that. But if you're bi-vo, co-vo, you just don't have those financial pressures because you don't have to rely on that. Now, there's nothing wrong with fundraising. Absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with having those partnership developments. But in some cases, you use the word vulnerable, it does put you in a place to where, you have to rely on that financial support from outside. So if you are truly co-vocational, I'm telling you, those financial pressures just aren't there.
Okay. I really like the direction you went in there, because that was going to be a question that I had as well, is does co-vocational ministry mean that we're replacing support raising? Which would be such a grief for me. I love support raising, and I would be super sad to see that start to disappear from the mission field, because I just think it's such a beautiful way to increase our faith and our dependence on the Lord. So what would you say is, practically, what does this look like to be partially support raised, but also partially supported from a career? How do you marry those two in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I would say there's no one right answer for sure. I've seen co-vocational, a leader has a fantastic job in the marketplace and they don't need any money outside for their salary support, but they need money for mission and ministry. So there's still fundraising that's going on, even though it doesn't go to their salary. And then I see people that have full-time jobs in the marketplace that it just, it falls a little short. So they do fundraising towards their salary, but it's not a full salary. It's just a portion of it. So there's just there's probably a dozen different levels of support coming from the marketplace in relationship to support coming through fundraising. So, and again, there's no one right answer. There's not like, oh, this is the exact way to do it. I've seen multiple beautiful different ways to do it, I guess. So I just think if there is income coming from the marketplace, though, it does put you in just a more stable position where you don't have to rely 100% on the support that's coming from outside.
Fantastic. Well, I don't want to be too much of a devil's advocate here, but everything we've talked about so far has just been such an incredible potential. There's so much room to grow with co-vocational ministry. There's so many positives that you're seeing coming out of it in the Send Network. And I'm just wondering if we could take sort of a realistic look at what some of the challenges are at incorporating co-vocational ministry moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's interesting. Over the last almost 10 years, probably, I've had the opportunity to interview dozens and dozens and dozens of co-vocational leaders. And I have 8 questions I always ask them. The first question is always, what's the greatest benefit of being co-vocational? And 100% of the time, it has something to do with what we've already talked about, access to a mission field. Leaders use different language, but that's what they're talking about. The second question is, what's the number one challenge of being co-vocational? And I would say 95% of the time, and you could guess what the answer is, it's time. Because if you have a full-time job in the marketplace and you're trying to start something, time management, balance, healthy rhythms. Again, different leaders use different language, but it has something to do with time management. So that is absolutely the greatest challenge of being co-vocational. So there's multiple things or different ways I speak into that, but there'd be 2 that I'd want to highlight here. The first one is you have to plant with a team. So anybody that's involved in church planting would say it's best to plant with a team, but if you're co-vocational, there's no other option. Like I'll meet with potential co-vocational planters, and if they don't have some semblance of a team, I just tell them, you need to hit the pause button until you have other people that are going to go with you to plant this church. Because you can't, work 40 or 50 hours a week in the marketplace and think you're going to do everything by yourself. So it goes back to what we talked about a minute ago, Maggie, about, having 2 or 3 co-vocational couples, 2 or 3 co-vocational singles going together. So it's all about team. You have to have a team. But then the second thing I would say is you have to rethink church planting. So you can't be co-vocational and plant a church the way we've always planted a church in a Western context, which in most denominations or church planting networks, it's about, raising a bunch of money and launching an attractional, Sunday-centric, program-driven kind of church. You just can't plant a church like that if you're co-vocational. And the reality, and we've already alluded to this, you don't have to. Because once again, if your primary income's coming from the marketplace, you have this much longer, slower runway to where I would argue you need to start with missionary behaviors and activities, not the Sunday morning worship service. So there's this little phrase that I tweet about once a week, and I'll kind of say like weekly reminder, and I'll say, if you work with church planters, you need to help church planters think less like a pastor starting a Sunday morning worship service and more like a missionary engaging in a unique context. So we need to think like a missionary, start with relational connections, engage the city, make disciples, and eventually gather those people together. So I would say, look, eventually you're going to, you'll probably have a Sunday gathering or a Friday gathering or a Saturday night gathering. But I would just argue, don't start there. Too often when we say someone's planting a church, jokingly, I'll say it's code word for starting a Sunday morning worship service. So if you're co-vocational, you have this much slower, more natural, incarnational, relational strategy to where you start with missionary activities and then eventually you get to the gathering. You just don't start with the gathering. So I think those are 2 things that can help overcome the challenge of time. Is you have to do it with a team and you have to think completely differently about church planting.
Well, and that's such a good point because the Sunday morning service is just one arm of the church. That's just one reach that the church should be making. If you're going to be truly a part of your community and a support to your neighbors and everything else, there's 100 ways that manifests other than a Sunday morning service. So it's a great reminder.
That's right. And, I say often, look, I'm not anti-Sunday gathering. I mean, as the church, we are a gathering, worshiping community. But once again, I would just say to planters, just don't start there. Start by thinking and acting like a missionary in your context, and eventually you can get to where we'll gather people together.
Well, we like to close our conversations by offering our guest an opportunity to speak right to our audience and to their churches. So, Brad, I'm wondering, what would you say to the average North American church who is starting to imagine co-vocational ministry and looking for practical next steps? How could they get more involved or start to bring this into their model for ministry? What does that look like?
Well, first off, I would say if you know any bi-vocational or co-vocational leaders, first off, I would say if you're a bi-vocational or co-vocational leader, please be encouraged. And I would say also, please don't be shy in telling your story, because other people need to hear your story. But then secondly, on the flip side of that, I would say if you're not bi-vo-co-vo, but if you know some bi-vocational or co-vocational leaders, please tell their story. I mean, you need to tell their story to be an encouragement to them, because unfortunately there's too many bi-vocational, co-vocational leaders that this isn't right, but they feel like second class church leaders because they're not fully funded. So tell their story to be an encouragement to them, but also tell their story to crack open the imagination of other people. So when you tell that story of a school teacher that's, engaged in mission and ministry, there'll be other school teachers that will say, I didn't even know that was an option. Like, I thought I had to choose between being a school teacher and being, a church planter or being engaged in mission. So I would just, tell those stories of others. That's part of how I think we need to kind of like change this, what I would call a biased narrative around bi-vo-co-vo, is that we need to tell the stories of people that are actually doing it. And then I would say, man, if you want to dig in a little bit more, there's actually a page that we launched about a year ago on the Send Network's website. There's different ways to get to this single page, but one of the best ways to get to it is just covochurchplanting.com. So if you go to covochurchplanting.com, you'll see there's a short little video. It's me just giving kind of a 6-minute kind of summary of like what is co-vocational church planting. But if you watch that little 6-minute video, there's actually an opportunity to where you can sign up for a webinar. I do a live webinar every month. It's just a 50-minute webinar to where we dig in a little bit deeper about the benefits and challenges of CoVo. And then after that webinar is over, I send whoever registered for a webinar several different resources. But then also on that page, you don't have to sign up for the webinar. Also on that page, there's probably about a dozen different ebooks and PDFs that dig into all these topics. And then at the very bottom of the page, there's probably about a dozen different stories. Although there's hundreds of beautiful stories of CoVo planters all across North America, we just highlight probably 10 or 12 of those stories, and you can access some of those stories at the bottom of the page.
Okay, fantastic. I'm glad that you mentioned the ebooks, because I really, really enjoyed the Rethink. Let me see. Let me just get this title correct here. So it's Rethink 12 Missiological Principles for Church Multiplication. And then today we referenced a lot of co-vocational church planting. Both of those are ebooks that you've authored. But that 12 Missiological Principles, I really enjoyed reading that. So is that where they can access those?
Yes. So the co-vocational church planting ebook is on that page. The Rethink book isn't, but if someone just Googled Rethink ebook, it would take you to a page where you could download it for free as a PDF ebook. And then also people could just reach out to me personally. And I've got a couple other ebooks that aren't on the page right now. There's another shorter, more concise ebook that's called Exploring Co-vocational Church Planting. And so if it's okay to share, Maggie, so I have a personal blog that is just missionalchurchnetwork.com. So if you go there on the About page, it lists my email address. You could just go there, shoot me an email and say, hey, I'd like this other CoVo ebook, and I'm happy to send that as well.
Amazing. Well, I will make sure that there are links to everything you just referenced in our show notes today. Just a reminder that you can access those at globalmissionstoolbox.com/podcast. And then just click on this episode and you'll have all the information you need. Brad, thank you so much for being here with us today. I just have learned so much and have enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I've always enjoyed this particular conversation around CoVo planting. So thank you, Maggie.
Of course. Well, God bless you. And thanks everyone for listening. We hope today's episode was an encouragement to think outside the box. If you have any questions or comments and you want to reach out to us directly, you can always email us at info@globalmissionstoolbox.com. We would love if you would join our communities on YouTube or Instagram. And we would also really appreciate if you would consider leaving us a review here on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to help others find our program. This podcast is produced by the Global Missions Toolbox. We hope you'll stop by our website to check out the resources we've curated, especially for senders like you, believers who support missions however God has called them from right where you are. Join us again in 2 weeks, and we will continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.